Hi, I'm Tim DeChristopher. I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah, and I'm one of the directors of a group called Peaceful Uprising, which is a climate justice group that's focused on civil disobedience. We got started about a year and a half ago, kind of in the wake of my own act of civil disobedience of disrupting a BLM oil and gas auction at the very end of the Bush administration. Part of the reason that Peaceful Uprising started was that we really wanted to take what we saw going on around climate change and make that into a very serious social movement. And I think that's the first thing that we have to think about when we're ready to go beyond the environmental movement, is to make sure that we're actually a movement and not just lobbyists. We have to lobby. That's a part of what we do. But there's a big difference between lobbyists and a social movement that has to lobby. Lobbyists have the luxury of already having access to power. They're the ones who buy congresspeople so that they get to just go and present their ideas and be listened to. For lobbyists, having a good idea supported by good data is enough. Then they can get what they want, because they don't really want to radically change things that much. They want to kind of keep going in the direction that we're going. A social movement, on the other hand, are by definition those who don't have access to power. Because we're those who want to take things in a radically different direction than they've been going so far. That means that our ideas are in opposition to the conventional ideas that are in charge. And so for us as a social movement, just having good ideas supported by really good data is not enough. That's not going to win for us. That's something that Congressman Larson brought up, that all this is very sensible and makes a lot of sense, and that's why it's never going to go anywhere in the U.S. Senate. And I think that's a point that we have to keep in mind, that for us it takes pressure. For us, if we want to get what we want, we have to create a crisis, because we know that if we're actually successful, if Congress passes a carbon tax, that's going to put a lot of fossil fuel corporations out. The point of this is getting us off fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel corporations are the richest and most powerful corporations in the world. And if our Congress actually stands up to them, those corporations are going to get pretty pissed. And they're going to create a crisis. They're going to create a lot of social tension. And so if we want our political leaders to go down that path of standing up to the fossil fuel industry, we have to create an even bigger crisis if they don't. We have to create an even bigger amount of social tension in order to get them to go down that path. The other big difference between lobbyists and a social movement is that lobbyists have the luxury of being able to take things one little step at a time. All they're trying to achieve is what they're really being paid to achieve for this bill, to get that bill passed. But social movements have a vision of the world that we want to achieve. And that vision is extremely important to empowering our members, because our success as a social movement is entirely based on the empowerment and the passion of the people involved in our movement. And we need that vision of where we're headed, and we need to be open about that. We know that all the stuff we're talking about this week, as I said, is in opposition to the richest, most powerful corporations in the world who control our government. We know that nothing discussed here this weekend is at all acceptable to the corporate forces that are controlling our government. Not just in our next Congress, but in our last Congress. None of this is acceptable. None of this will happen within that corporate power structure that controls our government. So our goal really is to overthrow that corporate power structure. If this whole conference aims to be anything more than intellectual masturbation, it needs to be a call for revolution. It needs to be a revolution against that corporate power structure. And the other thing about a social movement is that they never win by having the majority. There's never really been a successful social movement in this country that's had the huge majority on their side. We saw last year with the healthcare debate, poll after poll after poll showed that somewhere around 75% of Americans wanted a public option, and a huge number wanted single payer. We didn't get a public option. Single payer never even came up. By contrast, there was a poll done in June of 1963, 2 months before Martin Luther King led his march on Washington, that showed that almost 70% of Americans thought that whites and blacks were treated equally in America. This was before the Civil Rights Act, before Fair Housing Act, before any of that. most people said, there's not a problem. That whole racism thing, it doesn't exist. Does that sound familiar? The problem doesn't exist. And yet, we got a Civil Rights Act the very next year. And we didn't have to wait for the last redneck in Mississippi to stop being a racist in order to get it. We got it because the people who understood there was a problem were willing to really fight and really sacrifice in order to change it. And that's the kind of passion that we need in this movement. You know, the goal of the civil rights movement was never to make Bull Connor just really like black people. That wasn't their goal. Their goal was to get the people on their side to really fight to end that war that was segregation. And we need to keep that in mind when we go about building coalitions, because there's a couple different ways to build coalitions. We can reach out to those who are already in power, or we can try to create the world that we want to see and create that new power structure. And reaching out to those who are already in power means making allies with corporations. Reaching out to those we want to see in power means reaching out to social justice groups. And the easy way to decide between that is that obviously we've already tried reaching out to corporations. We tried that partnership with US CAP, and we ended up with the Waxman-Markey bill, and that failed. So that's an easy way to make that decision, but we should understand why that failed. Because there's a big difference in empowerment between working with corporations and working with social justice groups. Working with corporations requires us to say but a lot, and working with social justice groups requires us to say and. When we work with corporations, we have to say, well, we want a carbon tax, but we don't really want to change things that much. We want a carbon tax, but we want to continue on this path of growth, but you're still going to make huge amounts of profits, but we're still going to have the same kind of power structure. Working with social justice groups allows us to say and. We want a carbon tax, and we want social justice to go with it. We want a carbon tax, and we want green job training focused on minority communities that have historically been poor. And we want all these other things that are in line with that vision of the world that we really want to achieve. And that's what empowers our members. That's what makes people actually want to work for things. I think part of what deflated the youth climate movement last year was the Waxman-Markey bill that nobody really wanted to fight for. You know, we should remember that nobody really wants to fight for a cleaner, greener version of the world we have now, because that would still be a world of injustice based on exploitation, filled with people who are afraid of their own government. And that's not really a world worth fighting for. And the final thing I want to leave you with is that is this truth that we need to start being a little more honest about in the climate movement. And that is that it's probably too late to prevent the collapse of our industrial civilization as we know it. Things are probably going to get pretty ugly. And it's time for our movement to start thinking about what kind of power structures we want to be in place when things fall apart. About what kind of world we want to be living in and who we want to be in control of that world when things do get ugly. Do we want the corporations that are currently controlling this country to be in power when people get even more desperate and are really seeking any kind of return to order? You know, we have some localized examples of what collapse looks like, whether it's environmentally induced, like in Darfur, or economically induced, like in Germany in the 1930s. And it's rare in those cases that people ever said, oh, we had this coming because of the fundamental flaws in the way that we've been living. Much more often they said, oh, it was those people. Those are the ones responsible for why things aren't going so well. Let's blame them. Let's take it out on them, and let's all sacrifice our civil liberties in order to restore some order and security. And that's when things get really ugly. And how that's going to play out with the climate crisis is being determined right now. Because right now we've had a little minor collapse in the financial system over the past few years. And what we've seen is unprecedented hostility towards immigrants and people of other religions that wasn't around a few years ago. And we're saying, oh, those immigrants, they're causing our problems because they're using our social services. They're taking our jobs. And we're seeing that extreme hateful rhetoric against them. And they're our natural allies in this, because how we approach the approach the climate crisis is being determined by how we approach the immigration issue today. If hatred wins the day today, we're in for a very dark tomorrow. And that's why we need to be allied with those social justice groups that we really want to be creating a just future no matter what happens ahead. Thank you.